Tasmania is one of the first jurisdictions in the world to become not just net zero, but carbon negative. Australia's island state lowered carbon dioxide emissions and increased capture by significantly reducing logging for pulpwood production.
If we go back to 2005, Tasmania's greenhouse gas emissions were 20 million tonnes of CO2. The technical term is equivalent, but we'll call it 20 million tonnes of CO2. Now, the complicated thing here is these are what are called net accounts. When we burn fossil fuel for energy, i.e. when we burn coal in power plants or petrol when we drive cars, etc., that's a source of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. Well, there's only really one thing that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's the growth of natural ecosystems, in particular forests. So when trees grow, they grow by drawing CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's what they build their biomass on. So forests remove from the atmosphere and store a lot of carbon. So when you look at our national greenhouse gas inventories, they're what's called net accounts, where you subtract from the emissions what's happening in the land and forest sector. In 2018, Tasmania's net emissions had dropped from 20 million tonnes in 2005 to minus 2.2. Right? So they were negative, which meant that Tasmania as a state was removing more carbon from the atmosphere than what it was putting back into the atmosphere. Well, why was that? Well, over that time period, there'd been a dramatic reduction in logging of native forests. And in part, that was due to the closing down of a big pulp mill. So that was one cause of the reduction in logging. Another cause was that there was actually a drop in demand for wood chip from native forests. And so there was a reduction in the emissions from logging those native forests. Plus, there were two other important factors here. There's only about, say, 2% of the forests each year are being logged. The rest of the forest is growing, and that's removing carbon. So you've got natural forest growth. And then the other really big important factor for Tasmania, it uses very little fossil fuel for energy. Most of its electricity, all of its electricity, really comes from hydropower. Right?
I was going to ask you how much did that play into it? So how much is the position
huge.
that Tasmania was in already played part, didn't it?
Yeah, huge part. But that's the lesson. If you can stop using fossil fuel and use clean energy sources like hydro, wind and solar, plus you can reduce your logging of native forests, then it's win-win because you're avoiding fossil fuel emissions, you're reducing fossil fuel emissions because you're using clean energy, and you're using what we call the mitigation power of natural forests to remove carbon and store carbon from the atmosphere. And really that's what we need to be doing. We need to be avoiding emissions going up and increasing removals going down. So Tasmania is a very good case study which shows when you've got both those things happening, when you've got a clean energy plus better forest management, you can get negative emissions. So
this kind of change in the structure of things, can this be applied to other areas of the world? And I mean, obviously other areas in Australia as well?
Yes, it can. I mean, obviously not everywhere has got the water resources that Tasmania has to have the hydroelectricity. But, already Australia is now getting about 30% of its electricity from clean energy sources, wind, solar and hydro. As well as these large-scale hydro schemes, like in Tasmania, there's what are called kind of small pumped hydro schemes as well. Queensland wants to invest in them, but we're seeing, all the money now for all the private investment money for new energy systems is going into clean energy. It's going into wind and solar and batteries, storages, and that's because it's far more cost-effective and profitable.
It's a benefit that it is both of those things, but also obviously it's going to be better for the environment. So how much of an impact could this have on global warming if other nations start to adopt the practices at this scale as well?
Well, first of all, in order to limit global warming, we have to stop using fossil fuel. right? So the faster we transit from using fossil fuel to clean energy, the sooner we reduce emissions and prevent further warming. So that's essential. But, changing how we manage our native forests and putting more investments into plantations and which take the pressure off native forests and making better use of the mitigation power of native forests, that's the only carbon and capture storage system we have that works at scale. All this talk about technological carbon capture and storage, it's speculative. We don't have anything that works at scale. Even if it does work, it's just going to add to the cost of fossil fuel. And fossil fuel is already more expensive than wind and solar and hydro. So the only carbon and capture storage system we have that works are our native forests. So globally, this is a huge opportunity. We need to accelerate the investment into clean energy production and change how we manage our native forests, because that's the only way we have of removing and storing carbon.